Good morning. My name is Simba Elijah Charles Kiage. Welcome to Metropole Television. This is your economic review. Now let's pick an issue that everybody does know is happening worldwide. Now only a few, mostly privately owned airlines in the region are now profitable, according to the Airlines Association of South Africa. Now, the South African body asserts that most airlines have been hit hard by the pandemic and lockdowns have been catastrophic for aviation. Now, the health and safety of customers and staff had been the primary concern for most of the airlines, which saw most of them support the initial hard lockdowns, widely seen as a way to flatten the infection curve and create the breathing space for public health services to roll out testing, educate and change people's social behavior, and to prepare facilities to cope with the rise in infections and deaths. Now, most airlines ran into the inability to trade and generate revenue while still facing fixed costs, a factor that triggered an industry-wide liquidity crisis, which forced organizations to rapidly implement drastic cost-saving measures, with many employees having to take pay cuts, being placed on a paid or unpaid leave, temporarily laid off, and in the worst affected businesses, retrenched. All right, that's exactly where we find ourselves this morning. We therefore begs for us to look at what the liquidity and vibrancy in the aviation sector is now as we talk about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if you actually look at that, if you look at the liquidity and vibrancy in the aviation sector, you can actually see that most of the companies, all the way from Air Senegal, Rwanda Air to American Airlines, they're talking about just a liquidity crunch in these companies. And this actually did start at the start of this year. And remember, we haven't gone so far and we haven't actually gotten done with the COVID-19 pandemic, which means that this liquidity crunch and the vibrancy in these airlines is still going to be a factor even as we clear the last quarter of this year. So which begs the question this morning, therefore, is what can governments do, therefore? And what sort of financial relief can be available for its airlines? And this morning, to help us discuss this topic in depth and understand what the effect has been so far on the airlines, we are joined by Lyndon's Brent, is the managing director, Plain Talking. Lyndon's, how are you, sir?
Hi, good morning, Simba. Good morning to all the viewers today. Thank you for having me on the show.
Happy to have you around. Let's talk about what the effect of the coronavirus pandemic really has been on the aviation sector, Lyndon's. How could you summarize it?
Well, let's use one number. The industry is currently burning through cash at a rate of $300,000 every minute, US dollars. That's just to cover the fixed costs that they've got after they've tried to compress costs. We've seen a drop in demand for air travel, a 90% drop, the most recent tally up, and a similarly, although a lot of airlines have tried to reconfigure aircraft and repurpose them for carrying cargo, the little bit of additional revenue that they're generating from that is by no means filling the hole that has been left by passengers not traveling. If we look at that in terms of Africa, well, in normal times before COVID, this industry supported around 7.5 million jobs across the continent. That's jobs directly in aviation, jobs in services supported by aviation, and in allied sectors like tourism. More than half of those jobs are at risk. Around 4.5 million of those African jobs are at risk. And if we look at the contribution to GDP, again, in normal times, this is a sector that probably contributes around 63 billion US dollars to Africa's combined GDP, and around 37 billion of that GDP contribution will be lost just this year. So it's not a sector to be sneezed at. It's one that I think governments really do need to take seriously, because if they want to have any form of economic recovery, then they need to safeguard their whole air transport ecosystem. And let's just be clear, it's not just airlines that are in a hole financially. all of the entire value chain, airports, air navigation services, ground handlers, fuel suppliers, your safety oversight authorities, anybody who derives a revenue from this industry is feeling the financial crunch at the moment.
Yes, Lyndon, I want to come in on this issue differently, though, because now, yes, we've seen airlines cry to the governments for some sort of support, but out of what sort of support specifically can the African governments extend to their airlines so far just to see them come out of this liquidity crunch that we're talking about?
Sure. So there are various levers that governments can pull, and I think everybody understands that certainly in Africa, there's competition for public spending. Ideally, it would be wonderful if governments could to airlines, whether they underpinned that with equity, like we've seen in Germany, for example, with Lufthansa, where the state has taken an equity position, but on the proviso that the airline buys it back as soon as possible, and the equity doesn't include voting rights, so they don't exercise control. It's purely there to underpin as a guarantee on the loan. Or they provide loan guarantees so that the companies can go to the capital markets themselves and raise the capital that they need. And then there are other things they can be doing. They could be doing tax waivers, deferrals on taxes, tax holidays. They could there are relief funds available. The IMF and the Africa Development Bank and several other institutions got together about 3 months ago, and they've pledged well over $30 billion to be used as relief aid for Africa's tourism and airline sector. But governments have got a chokehold on a lot of that money, and so it's not flowing to the recipients. So they could free up the administration around that, get that money flowing. User charges, the statutory charges and levies that are exacted on air transport, your airport charge, your tourism levies and things like that. A lot of those things, or carbon taxes, defer those or reduce them or defer the next round of increases. So there are, as I said, various levers that governments could pull to provide some form of relief. Ideally, those that are going to give cash without adding to the debt burden.
Yes, Lennon, do you think that our regional economies are too much exposed by the pandemic to efficiently cover the ailing airlines now? Is that going to be a proper argument? Because if you look at exactly what we're doing, is that we're really trying to get by the day, if you look at exactly what our economies are doing.
Precisely, and that was the reason why those lending institutions and donor organizations put together that rescue package. For that very reason, that they recognize that, in many parts of Africa, in Latin America, in other parts of the, other emerging economies, you've got so much competing pressure for a very limited government fiscal ability. And so they needed to add to that pot to make it available. But that still doesn't mean, while governments may not have cash in hand, they still have their hands on those other levers. They can still provide those other forms of relief that I mentioned.
Yes, Lyndon, is the question of up to when, because of the unpredictability of this time around, also going to be a factor? Up to when? Yes, you're asking for us bailers now, but up to when?
Yeah. And that unfortunately is how long is a piece of string, until we've come to find a way to coexist with COVID, like we did with HIV, like we managed to do with other viruses. And this is one of the reasons why all of the big air transport industry associations like IATA and the Airlines Association and Airports Council International are saying, look, let's have one standardized set of measures for biosecurity for air travel and tourism. Let's stop with the arbitrary stuff. Let's stop with risk classification lists and quarantines and things that are deterrent. If we adopt the World Health Organization and International Civil Aviation Organization joint recommendations, that we have testing before anybody gets to an airport, at an airport as well, so that you then identify anybody who's either got the virus or who's displaying symptoms, and you stop them getting on a plane. That's all you need. COVID is no less dangerous if it comes from someone in a low-risk country or a high-risk country, whether it comes from a diplomat or a normal tourist. So why these different, confusing, inconsistent measures? What we need is consistency, standardization, harmonization, because then you'll reinstill the confidence that's needed for people to travel. And that then will kickstart again that economic revival. It'll help to limit government's exposure to airlines and the airlines' dependency for that support.
All right, lastly, Lyndon Burns, from where you stated this morning, somebody's going to throw a question at you. When do we expect to start seeing a rebound in the aviation sector worldwide? Because economies are also even talking about a second wave of infections, a second round, a third round of unprecedented measures in the economies. When do you expect to see a turnaround in the fortunes of the aviation sector?
And you're quite right. Initially in the early months of the pandemic, everyone was talking about a V or a J-shaped recovery. Now we're talking about an L recovery where we've fallen off the cliff and we're bouncing along the bottom. If we look at what's happened in China and in Southeast Asia, we've seen quite a remarkable recovery there. But they had very clear, strict, and observed the health recommendations that the authorities put in place. In Europe, it's not happening as well. In Africa, thank goodness, we seem to have things under control. The general industry consensus is that we'll see short-haul travel recover to 2019 levels by around 2022, 2023, and long-haul travel to recover to those levels by around 2024.
Pretty much, and that doesn't look good as we clear this morning, Lyndon Burns, from where you're sitting, isn't it?
It's going to a tough road ahead, but and why governments need to support the sector, because without air transport and an air transport system, economic recovery overall becomes so much harder, because you need airlines to transport people and goods between markets. If you look at Africa, we're about to grow Africa's population by around 1.5 billion people. Governments need to support, educate, health, clothe, and find meaningful employment for all these people. And the only way to do that is to promote trade, intra-Africa trade. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the Single Africa Air Transport Market are vital. And for that, you need air connectivity. So you've got to safeguard the air transport ecosystem.
Lyndon Burns, Managing Director, Talking Plane, thank you very much for speaking to us this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Moving on to other issues that we have for you this morning. Now, data by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics indicates that the value of Kenyan exports in the first 8 months of 2020 jumped to 423.3 billion and 20 billion shillings increase, from the same period in 2019. Food and beverage such as tea, coffee, fruits, vegetables accounted for the largest share of exports, while non-food industrial exports accounted for a smaller part of the total exports. Now, the top export markets for the Kenyan goods were Pakistan, Uganda, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Rwanda. Imports into the country in the first 8 months of 2020 decreased by 10% to 1.053 trillion from 1.18 trillion the year before. Now, the decline in the value of imports can be attributed to disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Non-food industrial supplies were the top import goods, while food and beverages formed the smallest share of those imports. Let's therefore this morning take a look at exactly where we are in terms of the exports that we have for you this morning and the value of exports that we're talking about. I believe look up from 2015 to 2019. The biggest value case point comes in 2018, where we're talking about that figure there, and 2019, which also did experience a decline. But now that figure, as we're saying, it could be looking different because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We therefore begs me to ask Tommy Randall a question this morning. Is COVID-19 proving to be sort of a blessing in disguise when it comes to the value of exports that we're taking out of the country, Tommy?
Simba, thank you for having me this morning. Yes, that seems to be the case on paper. If you look at the growth in exports, we can attribute it to several things. Most obviously, the increased demand from the countries that export from us. Maybe the lockdowns, having them at home, has increased the consumption and demand from those areas. And also, we could have found a way to be more productive to be able to export more, considering the lockdowns and not many people working during that period, the first 8 months of this year.
Pretty much, Tommy. But the question that anybody is going to ask you this morning, therefore, is that if we have this head start within the COVID-19 pandemic, what can the government do to sustain it? Because we do expect, as you are saying, that this point is bound to correct again. We're going to say, well, our imports now look bigger than our exports. What can we do now to stamp our position in these exports?
I think, Simba, one of the most important things to do is to continuously search for new customers in other areas, other parts of the world. So we can increase demand that way by finding new markets to sell our products. Secondly, to support the industry in any way possible, maybe in terms of infrastructure between farm to airport. That's one of the many options that the government can do to sustain and increase this growth.
Pretty much. Tommy, I want to take you back to that data on exactly what is contributing our biggest chunk of exports. And if you look at it, food and beverages such as tea, coffee, fruits, and vegetables accounted for the largest share of exports, while non-food industrial exports accounted for a small part of the total exports. Does that become a point of concern that still we are relying on what has been a traditional contributor to the biggest chunk of our exports as well?
It's always important to diversify our exports, but with those under the pandemic, when things were shut down, cargo planes were still flying back and forth. And you can see items like tea, coffee, and flowers are small. They can be packed into planes and be not much as affected as other products when it comes to exports. So that is one thing. Other goods that we export probably were far more affected because roads are transporting. You see, there was a lockdown with the borders with Tanzania for quite some time, with Uganda for quite some time, though I am surprised that exports to Uganda did increase despite the border being closed. So there's some curious things when you look at these statistics.
Yes, just on a policy level, Tommy Brendel, this morning. I mean, if you look at our biggest contributors, tea, coffee, fruits, and vegetables, do you think that there's something that needs to be done differently, especially in the agricultural sector now, just so that we can actually continue pushing and stamping our footprint in the international market?
From a policy perspective, I would say maybe provide to smaller producers so that we can increase production. From that perspective, what else would I say? Help any way they can in form of tax breaks, guaranteed access to money. Yes, things like that.
Pretty much. All right, Tommy, I would like to move to the next issue this morning. All right, which is really on the process of making budget for the year 2021-2022, which has officially kicked off with Kenya's National Treasury and Planning Ministry inviting institutions, private sectors, and governmental organizations and the general public to submit their taxation proposals. Now, the suggestions, which will be contained in the finance bill, form the basis upon which the 2021-2022 national budget will be prepared. Now, the National Treasury maintains that the proposals aim to support economic recovery from adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, strengthen revenue collection, and promote macroeconomic stability. Now, the office also indicates that the submissions should also be specific on the proposed amendment to the law, supported by the statement on the issue to be addressed and a clear justification for the proposed amendment. Now, Kenya's budget has been on an upward trend with an ever-increasing appetite for expenditure and loans. Should this be top priority in the next budget for the country, Tommy?
Health sector is going to be a big factor in this, even though it starts at 2021. We
Yes.
don't know how far along we'll have gotten in regards to this COVID pandemic.
Yes.
So I would suspect that we would need to add more money into our health institutions, procurement of PPEs, maybe a little bit of a tax break more further, so that we can be better prepared to deal with the pandemic as it goes forth.
Yes. Tommy, somebody's going to look back and say, well, for the very first time, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we did actually cross the 7 trillion mark in terms of our in terms of our public debt. Do you think that should be a bigger factor for anybody looking at our 2021-2022 document?
There's good debt and there's bad debt. I think our debt is good debt because most of it are going to government projects that are dealing with infrastructure. Jubilee has its Big Four agenda, so they're pouring a lot of money into those projects. County governments also have a lot of their projects going on that include building the infrastructure. So those will have a multiplier effect over time, which will generate more revenue, which means we'll be probably in a better position to pay our debt as long as the money is used for what it's supposed to, as long as there is no waste in this process.
Yes, but Tommy, somebody's going to ask you, I mean, this 2021-2022 document is going to come at a time when the country has been grappling with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic that have reduced KRA's ability to collect tax, which is the biggest supplier to our document at any one point in a year. How do you think this is going to affect the outlook for the next budget, 2021-2022?
I think it just means we're going to need to borrow more, or we're going to need to widen our tax base,
Yes.
find loopholes and ways to collect tax more efficiently.
Yes.
And KRA has stepped up to that. They hired more people. They got an influx in their budget to enable them to hire more people to go after more tax cheats. So I think it's possible. It can be done.
It comes at a time when we're actually even talking about the electioneering period as well. Anything that anybody looking at that document would do, maybe to safeguard the economy from what we have known has been a traditionally biting time in terms of local investments every time the country approaches an electioneering period.
But right now, as far as you and I know, the election is in 2022, second Tuesday of August 2022.
Yes.
Now, that budget, it runs from 1st of July 2021 to 1st of July 2022. So we shouldn't really be impacted much by electioneering unless we have some kind of referendum or some kind of, the only possibility is a referendum, which would require campaigning, which usually has those same types of effects.
Yes.
But for now, we can work under the assumption that there will not be an election during that time period.
Pretty much. Tommy Randall, thank you very much for taking your time to speak to us this morning, sir. Always invaluable.
Thank you.
All right, that's exactly what we have for you this morning. In terms of our economic review, we take a short break here on Business AM, but once we come back, sector trends 2146. That's your SMS line at Metropole TVKE across all your social media platforms. I am at Charles _Kiage.